there will be those brands that continue to push, and there will be those brands that continue to follow the best practices, and they'll be best for a reason. What's exciting to me is people were buying ideas, and that's what we sell for a living. That's what an agency sells, is ideas. And this was a place where artist to consumer buy my idea. It was never a canvas. It's never just a glass of wine. It's the provenance. It's whatever the sommelier tells you you're supposed to taste, you start to taste. It isn't that. It is what you want it to be, and it is the power of the person who created it coming back to you. And that's the baseline for our industry and for real great art in the world.
Welcome back to the 13th episode of Not a JPEG, a podcast for creatives and entrepreneurs pushing for innovation within Web3 and the blockchain.
Where each week we explore everyday sectors of modern society and how NFTs will revolutionize how we start, scale, and sell businesses.
Yep.
My name's Katerina. This is Michael.
Hello, hello, hello.
And we are the hosts of Not a JPEG. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad that you stumbled upon our podcast. If you could hit the subscribe button on whatever podcasting app you're listening to, we would so appreciate it. Mm-hmm. And if you're on social media, check us out at Not a JPEG Podcast. We post daily little gold nuggets of everything that's said in our episodes, which are easy to share, reflect on, and, express to anybody that is in your life that wants to learn more about NFTs, or you're forcing to learn more about NFTs. This is great insights in 1-minute snippets for you to share with anybody in your network.
I guess this is what we in advertising would call bite-sized content.
Exactly. That's it. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Mm-hmm. Today, we are exploring how NFTs and Web3 will revolutionize advertising, and we have a super special guest joining us today.
Yeah, and so this guest hails from my side of the pond, from my world, from advertising. His name is Matt Hassell. Now, Matt is an award-winning chief creative officer who's had his work recognized by the likes of Cannes, One Show, Webbies, and Clio's, just to name a few. Now, Matt and I first met when he was the CCO of KBS, actually at the Cannes Lion International Festival of Creativity. We met around 3 a.m. at the Gutter Bar. That's where our paths first crossed. And they have recently crossed again, in this new and exciting world of Web3, because Matt has most recently pivoted into starting his own creative company within the space called Ultralight Creative. Now, I've got a lot of respect for Matt for taking this leap and venture, and I actually consider him to be one of the creative advertising leaders as far as pushing for this type of innovation and onboarding brands into the world of Web3. We're really excited to have him on the show today, so without further ado, let's bring Matt on.
Hey, Matt, welcome to Not a JPEG. How's it going?
It's going great. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate you being here and taking the time to talk to us about advertising and how NFTs will revolutionize that industry. But before we get into that, tell us a bit about yourself, Matt. Who are you, and what is your personal elevator pitch?
Yeah, listen, first off, my pleasure to be here. I'm really excited about this. I think the elevator pitch, and I can be verbose, so I'll try and make it an elevator ride. But, I think we'll just start with what I'm doing currently and just a little bit of background. I've recently founded a new creative agency, and I should actually say creative company, because I'm trying hard not to use the agency word these days, because I'm trying to allow for the creativity I've learned in advertising to impact my clients beyond just advertising, beyond just communication sometimes, into maybe product design or strategic design or even planning. I've sort of was buoyed, I think, by all the energy that existed around Web3 over the past couple of years to say, hey, there's something happening here that I think I can borrow from to launch into a new creative sphere for some of my clients. That's not to say that my full, offering is all Metaverse or all Web3 or all blockchain. In fact, it isn't. But I do want to stand for innovation in the space. And obviously what's going on in the Web3 world is a major part of that.
Absolutely, for sure.
And so, that's a great, I appreciate that actually was an elevator pitch. I'm pretty sure if we were sitting right now or standing in an elevator, it would probably take us to like the 11th or 12th floor. So I appreciate that. You touched on what, Ultralight does, and, you're in this metaverse or Web3 space, that was part of what you mentioned. We're very curious, when and why did you actually enter this space? Like, what brought you here? What garnered your interest, and why did you decide to take this leap into, building a creative company out of it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have been thinking about that a lot in preparation for this conversation. I think at the end of the day, my resource, what I, sort of use to create, is creativity, is creative people, is that energy that exists when you have a lot of creative people together. And my first entree into understanding, or the first time I heard the word metaverse, was listening on Clubhouse and listening to a bunch of designers I respected talking about things. And one designer stood up whose name just eludes me, but I wish it hadn't. She was on this Clubhouse chat, and she said, "Oh, I'm a metaverse designer," and I'd never heard the word. This was, I think this was late 2019, I think, and I was just like, so, as soon as I heard it, I was interested. And then, there's some people and some artists that I'd respected who are also in the space. And from there, you start to do your research. You start to Google, you start looking around. And I came to Metaverse when it was still a philosophy, I think, when it was about decentralization, when it was about creative expression and expressionism. And, that energy attracted me. And it attracted me because, for a couple of reasons. One is, these people are really interesting. They're makers and creators in the space. I wonder how I could, work with them at my then agency, to have them sort of, help me create for my clients. So that's how it started. It almost was like, is this a new group of people I can lean on to create something really interesting? And then I quickly found out how excited the rest of the world was as it started. I sort of got in around the time most people did, I think, that have any passion for the space. And then I quickly started to see, I think a couple of months later, Beeple had his big sale. And all those things started to happen, and you're starting to like take it all in. So the initial, it was just the word, and it was the passion of a creative person talking about the space that got me excited and got me interested.
Right. And that's interesting. So I have a follow-up to that. The people that you've come across within this space, the creatives, that's kind of what you mentioned drew you in. Do you see any difference between the type of creatives you see in the Web3 NFT space and the creatives that, maybe we're more traditionally used to in the world of advertising?
Yes and no. What I'd say the biggest difference to me is their willingness to share at a prototype level, or their willingness to share their stories, or their willingness to talk about the creative process, which is individualized. And I think when you're working in the advertising world, we tend to, for good reason in some cases, focus on sort of what the best practices are, when it comes to, if you're doing a print ad or a television spot, remember those, or if you're doing, a banner ad, you're like, what is the best way to do this? And I think the lack of, sameness that can exist for different creators in the space leads them to want to talk to each other a little bit more. And so it was really simple to connect with somebody, via Discord, via some of the courses I took, in fact, and say, hey, you want to chat later about, what you're doing, and I'll tell you what I'm doing, and we can just talk. And it was amazing to me, the sort of well of creativity and information you can get from some of these designers I'm using as the blanket term, about what their projects were. And it was equally, and I'll say this, even now when I talk to people, there's equally this sense of like, I think I can do something like this in the design function I might currently hold at a more traditional design shop, agency, whatever, but also, and I have this passion project that I'm doing, which is also really interesting to me, that there's this other side of people believing in it so much. And, I love craftspeople and I love creatives, and there's so many of them willing to share their sort of story that, it's attractive. It's an attractive place to be.
Yeah. It's really interesting you say that, because I've noticed it too. Like, my background's more in CPG, and there's very few boundaries to collaboration and asking questions in the Web3 NFT creative space. Whereas if you go and ask questions to somebody in, the manufacturing side or other sort of business ventures, they're very closed off. And even to the point where they're like, oh, I can't answer that question. You'd have to pay me for it as a consultant. And it's just like, where's the give and take between both parties and the ability to create something together? And I think in Web3, we have that because everybody, as you said, is really keen on building something together and seeing, oh, maybe this person can help me. Maybe this person can fuel an idea or inspire me in some way or ask a question I never thought about. And that, I think, is what makes the space so special.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, to add to that is I almost wonder if part of that collaborative ethos comes from the fact that this industry and space is still so young, right? Like, there aren't really any experts. They're just people who have been here like maybe a few months longer than you or I have. Yeah. And I think in the interest of pushing the space forward, really believing in what it can bring to the world, people are more willing to collaborate and come together to, like, you know, it's kind of like for the good of the space, not just for the good of whatever it is I am working on.
Yeah.
Yeah. There really is an interesting give and take there. I think it does speak to that overarching sentiment and belief and spirit and philosophy, whatever you want to call it, about decentralization, which really has, you know, at least my introduction and the people I've spoken to really does have an egalitarian sort of bent to it of like, let's go in and build and see what we can build together. You know, that definitely seems to be, you know, a big part of this. You know, I was introduced to that WAGMI, you know, we're all going to make it acronym very quickly. Yeah. And I was like, okay, well, that's what that means. That's why it's like sign off on all these messages. I'm like, great. Now I know. I didn't feel like such an outsider. But I mean, that still is key to me. You know, I know, and I know we'll probably talk a little bit about what more people have come to understand through terms like, you know, NFT art and crypto and you know, the side of the business or the side of the world that has gotten a little negative lately. But I do think at its core, and for me as, you know, a chief creative officer, creative director, the creativity and the willingness to talk about projects, it's, you know, that's the best part. And Michael, I'm sure you can appreciate this. Both of you can appreciate this. You know, there's something great about that moment when you're just creating and asking about half an idea. You know, it's great to present an idea. That's one thing. But when it's like, I don't know, I'm just thinking elephants. Elephants seem to make sense here. Like, and, you know, you're just like, your partner or somebody you're working with may say, what do you mean? You know, and then you get into that conversation. I feel like the whole space is in that half a linear, half a line drawing sort of space right now. And where it's going to go could be anybody's guess. And I mean that from a creative perspective, not a advertising, how do we take advantage of the space perspective, but just in general.
Yeah, that's so true.
I have a kind of a follow-up thought on your thoughts on decentralization, because you just mentioned that the decentralization and everybody kind of believing in this egalitarian value is what allows for a lot of this idea of collaboration. But there's a lot of talk in the more degen side of Twitter spaces that I'm on frequently, that people believe that we don't actually care enough about the true values of decentralization, like the technology being owned by everybody. A lot of people, you know, and we see this in general in society, people want security, and that sometimes gives up your autonomy. So do you think the premise of decentralization is being maintained in the creative sense, or is it in a full sense, like based on your experiences and your discussions? Like, I don't know if you're on the Twitter side of things, like I'm there all the time. So yeah, in your experience, like, do you think decentralization is really key to this moving forward, I guess? Do you see it being maintained, or do you see with like mass adoption or bigger brands coming in that might change?
That's a really great question. And there's no way I actually know the answer, I'll be honest, but I can give you my thoughts on what I think could happen.
I'm really curious.
I worry. Yeah, I mean, I really do. I worry a little bit that it's going to get co-opted pretty quickly. And that, you know, we're looking at a single platform will rise to the fore. It'll be the thing that's the easiest for marketers to understand, maybe where a lot of the money can come in. And then you'll be stuck with, okay, you know, this is the metaverse. And I think it's natural for people to want to know what it is. I mean, I've had some clients ask, like, where's the door to the metaverse? And, you know, at first you're like, well, there isn't a door, but then it makes total sense. Of course you want to know, like, what's the URL I type in, and what is this the metaverse? You know, and I think the name change from Facebook might have added some confusion to it. And, you know, I'm actually sick of saying the word, despite the fact of having said it like 100 times, metaverse, but it is the hot word, right?
Yeah.
And I do think decentralization may not be as important to, you know, marketers. Their concern is people, of course, and where the actual audience is. but I think it's more of a concern to the creators. And so
Yes.
as a, sort of a commercial creator, a commercial sort of creative, I think I understand that. I understand that you have to have both. As somebody who really appreciates just like, a really well architected house in sort of, Decentraland or something, you're sort of stuck with, where do I want to spend my time and where do I want to find people? And I look at it two ways. One is brands that I'm talking to who are asking me for strong advice about how can I use one of these platforms to learn something about my audience, or how can I use one of these platforms to reach them in a new way? It's hard to completely sell them on the more traditional approach to advertising of just go here, build something, and people will come because of these 5 other things you're doing. And if you just, you parlay that to a typical digital campaign where maybe you're driving from, a banner, some search terms to a site, you want something to happen, you're doing proper UX. They want that sort of pathway to understand that pathway. And I can appreciate that. And then a lot of other people say, let's just experiment. Let's just try things here as an agency. And if you don't mind just putting on sort of my very professional hat here, do not experiment without understanding what objective you're trying to reach or what learning you're trying to achieve. You have to allow for something new could happen you didn't expect, but you have to, I don't want any of my clients ever just building something just to build it and then being like, it was an experiment, because I think that's a poor use of the term. When I'm asking people to experiment, it's to learn something that maybe impacts, the actual world they're in and makes them go, oh, we should put more money here, or, okay, that didn't work. And we set up, creative tests in 3 different platforms or something. But I really, it bothers me when, I have clients sometimes come to me saying, oh, we're just going to experiment there. And I'm like, okay, well, what are the parameters, and what are you trying to learn here? Because if you don't have that established, it's not an experiment. It's just a sort of like expression. It's a billboard in a desert, right? And you want to be careful not to have that.
Yeah. I feel like based on my observations, and maybe you guys too, because you guys work in advertising, can chime in on this, but it feels like that whole experimentation of these brands who just want to try something, they're doing it to be like the first in the metaverse. And, they're not really paying attention to like what the ethos is in the space, who's going to use it, what's the target audience, like whether it's their current audience or people who are already adopted it. And so you get these metaverse integrations that are kind of weird and feel disconnected,
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. And so I agree with everything you said, Kat. I also want to add to your bit about decentralization is that you're absolutely right. As a solo creator, someone who's working, doing like a side hustle or side project where, you're an artist, what have you, that decentralization is very important. But I think it absolutely doesn't matter to bigger brands who already operate as a centralized entity. So for them, why would they ever shift from being a centralized entity and just suddenly become a DAO or become more decentralized just to fit the ethos of this world, a world that doesn't, we kind of need them more than they need us at this point to usher in mass adoption. So the power, like they actually have the upper hand. They have a little bit more, there's a power imbalance there, right? At least that's kind of how I see it, right? And I think how many people in the space do see it as well.
Yeah, I absolutely think you're right. And I think you're both touching on something interesting, which is who are we speaking to, and I think there's been great activations in the metaverse speaking to people who'd never been to the metaverse. Last year, Miller Lite around Super Bowl had a really interesting sort of pop-up bar in Decentraland. They had a Super Bowl spot that sort of spoke to the metaverse. It was an attempt to be culturally relevant, which I think they nailed. I think they did a really good job of it. It wasn't meant to get a bunch of people in the metaverse to leave the metaverse at that moment, go out and buy a 6-pack and come back. It was meant to have a brand presence, to be a little bit innovative, to be, du jour. And that in and of itself is interesting. So this is why, despite, some of the activity numbers we're seeing and, just like what the general tenor around Web3 and blockchain is, there's still something to be learned. And you can use it, or you can use NFTs or the blockchain as a point of interest for your brand to get a bit of a shine of, whether it's being first or it's being innovative, that can work. I would just say, if the clients are mine, just make sure you're recording your results and figuring out what you can do next to enhance that sort of brand aspect you're trying to speak to. I just think it's too early for anybody to go in and say, this is what the best practices are for Metaverse. And you guys know this, we're always, especially in the marketing world, rushing towards best practices, hopefully to best them and often to replicate them. And I think right now we can't have any, and maybe that's a good thing, because it's just, there's activity, there's creative energy, there's something, interesting happening, and brands should be around that. And, I've talked about this before, where I thought at some points, Web3 in general, and putting a flag in there somewhere, a little set of NFTs or building something in the metaverse, an activation in the metaverse, direct to avatar, which is something that we can talk about, which I find kind of fascinating. I think all of that is just, if you're doing it, learn something from it. Because, I remember doing activations back in the day for some clients for Vine. Remember Vine?
Oh, yeah.
And to say now that was useless is not the case. I mean, it taught my creatives, first of all, to learn how to get a creative idea across very quickly. Does that help with our new 6-second video rules in YouTube? Yeah, like it does. And did it help the brand at the moment? Yes, but it was a pop-up moment. It wasn't, we said, take all of your, brand sort of budget and put it into Vine videos. Of course, we're not going to say that.
Yeah, but it's so interesting you touched on the bit about best practices, because you're absolutely spot on. We do rush to those, and I think it's because it gives us a sense of control and replicatable sort of a formula, right? That we now have authority. We understand this. We're experts in this one thing. We can now bring that to clients and say, okay, we can replicate the success we've had in the past by just following the same formula. But the fact that formula does not yet exist in Web3 and in NFTs is actually beautiful, because I think we should embrace that more, because it gives us a little bit more license to be creative and to experiment, like you said, right? Which I think gives us a little bit more freedom and flexibility if we do fail, right? Because there aren't these set parameters yet. And I think that's a beautiful thing that we actually should embrace versus try very much to pinpoint and nail down at this point in time.
Do you guys, from your perspective, think that there's ever going to be a best practice for metaverse integrations in, the big brand sense? Like, do you think that'll actually happen, or do you think the technology is going to continuously evolve, that it'll be really challenging to nail down those best practices?
Yes. I think both will be true. What's most likely, though, like every other aspect of branding or advertising, is there will be those brands that continue to push, and there will be those brands that continue to follow the best practices, and they'll be best for a reason, I think. So I would say even now, there's probably some brands out there who early days sold some NFTs, got a return on the NFTs, hopefully kept a relationship with maybe somebody who bought the NFT or somebody who sold the NFT on their behalf. They've got some best practices immediately about what they should do next time in the space, or what the experience was. But I think there's always going to be the challengers as well, which is where it will get interesting. So if you apply it to, just for a moment, like more traditional retail, you're always going to have your sort of big box stores that work, end of aisles, like all of that, the dimensions there work. And then all of a sudden, Apple Store will be there. And then we'll start to see those stores have their little Apple Store sections within them. So it is the thrust of what's going to happen. Now, I also just believe that when there's a best practice that's established, either outwardly and everybody knows it, or you just start to observe it, you'd be, as a brand, a little bit silly not to pay attention to it. Now, you can use it as a platform to push away from and go, okay, let's set the next one. Or you can replicate it as an experiment to see what's different about your brand. So you kind of need those common practices. And then you can start to hang your sort of brand beliefs off of them, like lattice work almost, I think. And that's how you can get to an innovation space. But there's also this world where nobody is 100% sure. We're so early that nobody's 100% sure how to do it. And it does, harken me back to the days, the sort of pre-Web 2 days, before, Facebook was like the predominant sort of social network. Around, like, a lot of things seem valid, and a lot of things seem valid right now as a place to experiment. So I do think that there will be best practices. There kind of are best practices for some people already, but that is, if you treat them properly, those should be the sort of footholds for innovation for the right brands.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a great point.
Very good.
So I was going to use this as a segue. I think this is a great, talking about best practices and talking about, this sort of split between the ad world and this world that we're all in. What are you and Ultralight currently building Web3? Like, what are you bringing to your clients? Again, whether or not you go into detail about the types of projects, or just the overarching ethos or vision that you have for your company and what you aim to bring to your clients.
Yeah, appreciate that. I think, I'm not yet completed any of the projects, so I can't really go into the details, but
Sure.
I can tell you there's been a few attempts to sort of, there's some stuff in planning right now to build, to experiment, but to use the space the way it's culturally being regarded by the greater sort of, greater population at large. Meaning, I think people see NFTs as a bit of a mysterious world, not the people who are in the space, not the people who own them, not the people who are collecting. But I do think the bigger world of people, and I'm sure you guys know this better than probably anybody I know, there is a little shroud of mystery around it.
Yeah.
And, I think everyone wants to define it as fast as possible as a fad or as a scam or, whatever they can call it. But let's remember the blockchain is super valuable, no matter what, I think, even if it's just to learn from or to look at. And I think, as I sort of regarded that, I was like, oh, why don't we do some work with NFTs, but treat them and launch them as the mystery that they are. And so I wish I could get into a bit more detail. And maybe when I'm back on episode 93 or something, we can get into details and I'll be like, here's what happened there, guys.
I love that.
We'll hold you to it.
But I do feel like, there's that. And then a lot of what I'm doing is consulting on activations, creating some plans and creating some work for clients that want to or are excited about the space and want to try something. And that's where a lot of my philosophy of don't experiment without some sort of expected result. Like just have your thesis and know if it worked or not. And that's sort of it. Like, can we get people who haven't yet bought NFTs to buy NFTs because of our brand power? And I would argue there's some brands out there that can do that. I'm certain that, Nike probably got people to buy some sneakers and the NFTs they had that might not have bought them otherwise, right?
Yeah.
I can tell you from personal experience, my first purchases were NBA Top Shot, Dapper Labs Top Shot purchases, because that seemed like a fun thing my son and I could do together and collect cards. And, I've got them and I look at them and I don't do much more than to check them out once in a while. I'm not heavy in the space, but I think that's interesting. The other thing I look at a lot, speaking of Dapper Labs, is where NFTs fit in the NFTs and beyond, where it fits in the greater sort of digital ecosystem of the user and, how they're looking at it. And so, Dapper Labs did a great job of sort of having a live hosted Twitch stream while you were waiting in line for the drop of the cards. And to me, I'm not, I don't frequent Twitch all that often. Probably not a huge surprise, but I don't, I think it's cool, but it's, I'm a little aged out of that demographic, whereas my son was like all over it. And I was like, okay, so now they're being smart about, they have this thing, which for good reason, people have separated from the rest of the digital world that maybe shouldn't be all the time. And I mean, anything blockchain related. But then they bring in Twitch. So you're watching on Twitch, you're talking on Discord, and you're, about to buy some NFTs in the form of basketball trading cards. That to me is another point I like to bring to clients and say, you've got to not consider it this totally separate thing.
Right.
We have to remember, and you guys know this well, but I'll say it, anyhow. A consumer is just like us. They can drive downtown, see a couple billboards. They can then see some banner ads. They can then maybe see some NFTs, all from the same brand in the same day. It doesn't mean that they're a different person on the highway as they are, on their laptop as they are when they're sort of like about to buy something. But there are changes in that personality, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about. And this is really interesting to me, is what is the nature of the person who is in Decentraland or the Sandbox right now, or Roblox, or, decentralized or not, what these intrepids who are out there sort of like exploring, what is it about them that we as, brand builders can look at, learn from, and also speak to? So that's another interesting side of this too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but I do feel like that connectivity is really important for my clients to understand. I think a lot of them want information more than activation in the space right now, and I'm happy to provide that. And unfortunately, more often than not, I've had to say, I think the plan you have in place currently is not going to build your brand the way you're hoping it does.
Right.
And, I would try something a little bit different, or I'd do something else, because I do feel strongly that the blockchain itself and what it can bring to advertising specifically is really something I feel like we should be looking at more holistically than just as creative expression right now. I think, there's so many ways to use the ledger that is the blockchain to become, really important for brands, but it might not be as an expression to the audience necessarily. It could just be, oh, you know what? We have collectibles for good reason. We're, a bourbon brand, and we're going to put so many barrels away, and the blockchain is going to help us keep track of who owns them. It could be that simple.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting too,
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that's the biggest thing that when we talk to people both in our respective industries, you do find the sense that like people don't actually fully understand just how amazing this is and the implications it will have. And I think that's part of, the people who have taken the time to put in the research to really understand and comprehend, and being a little bit curious, because it does take that level of curiosity.
Open-mindedness.
And open-mindedness to get here. For us, we're like, holy shit, like how can you not see it? Like, how can't you guys see how excited and jazzed we are about this because of what it can offer? And I think that's the biggest leap to make. So I 100% agree that, what you're doing as far as the consulting side will pay off on the actual execution and production side, because you got to get them to your level first before you can help them produce. And I think for me, that's a great segue into the question that what's been your experience in transitioning some of these, like, I guess, Web 2 brands into being more Web 3? Like, are any challenges, any hurdles? Like, what's been the overall sentiment from them, as well as like some of, our colleagues in the space as well?
And to add to that, if what's motivated them to come to the space? Is it because like the CMO heard about it from someone else and it's like, oh, let's do that? Or is there like a younger person on their team who's, got bags and some cryptocurrency and they're like, oh, you should be building on this blockchain? Like what's the motivation? Who's driving them to come to you to then learn more about it?
Yeah, I mean, great questions. I think it's interesting because it's kind of from all sides. And I think there's, as with myself and everybody, a little bit of personal bias that everybody brings to it. Mm-hmm. The hype machine around it, and with algorithms these days, it's hard to tell if the news you're served is just because you've searched something or if it's just actually everybody's getting this news. But let's be real. NFTs, maybe starting with Beeple and his big sale, just took off into, sort of zeitgeist, and everybody was talking about it. Everybody knew what they were. And then Metaverse was either, in my experience, a little bit behind that and what it was. And, I think we all heard the story of somebody buying the house next to Snoop Dogg in Sandbox and how much that is worth. And I've looked at pitch decks, from a lot of Metaverse companies that are like, buying this now is like buying real estate in, Manhattan in the 18th century or something. And like, you just buy it now and hold on. And they may be right. They may be right. I think there's something to it. There's just so much around the ability to make money that it brings in a lot of different types of actors into the space. Mm-hmm. And that hype machine that exists made everybody cognizant of it. I do think, my personal belief is that a lot of great CMOs these days also remember when they were transitioning from a non-web or a Web 1 to a Web 2 world, some brands felt a little bit caught out in the cold. And this is where I'm grateful that I went through some of the interesting sort of transitions getting into Web 2, where I remember smart marketers, and at the time doing the right thing, saying we're never going to be on Facebook. That is not a controllable medium. That is, only young people. We're not a young person. And I was like, okay, I hadn't even thought of that. I was just trying to push like, hey, you should have a page. And this was much before, brands knew how to activate there, or the notion of like a brand should even try and be there. It was just people. Twitter, just people, like, how do we do this? And I also recall when there were brands having serious discussions about, should we launch our own social network as opposed we just made a website, let's not have a social network. So I think some of the people who lived through that as marketers are now CMOs and beyond, and, in different aspects of the industry. And they're like, I don't want to be caught a little bit cold. I want to learn about this as much as possible. And I want to activate. And maybe the best way to learn is to activate in the space. I think it's great that we have that too. I should be clear. I don't think brands should shy away from the space. I think you can learn by doing. I'm just saying, make sure there's learning coming out of it when I speak to doing something. Don't just do it to do it. Like, that is a problem. I haven't come across anybody who's doing it to do it, but I do come across some people where potentially the CEO is saying, we should do something here, and good thinking, nothing wrong with that. But I'm just trying to help them set up a more thoughtful process to learn from, and then eventually to activate in the best way that brand should activate. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very long half answer to your question, but it really is, to me, helping them sort of see the possibilities and then build the right sort of, instrument to get to the possible. I think what we're trying to do is leapfrog there. And I think it's the hype around it that draws it in. The other thing that's really, really fascinating to me, and something I think to some degree should be celebrated, is that the latest hype, or the wave 2, the crypto hype came in, and that's the first blockchain hype, which is still existing, of course. But then this NFT hype, to me, is so interesting that what we were, excited about was art. And I think that speaks well for somebody who loves creativity and for people who appreciate it, that they were really just excited about art. And, if I want to really break it down, what's exciting to me is people were buying ideas, and that's what we sell for a living. That's what an agency sells, is ideas. And this was a place where artist to consumer, buy my idea. And we'll guarantee you're the one who bought it, so you have that ownership level as it gets minted, and you're buying an idea. And I think a lot about the sort of physical manifestation of art versus a JPEG, right? Tip to the title of the show. To me, it's like, what are you actually buying when you buy art? And are you buying something that says something about you that can hopefully you can reflect on,
status,
that speaks to who you are? Are you buying some stat? Yeah, exactly. And so why not? Why wouldn't sort of NFTs do that? Because I think we've taken this belief, and I think it's a fair one, and this is a much bigger conversation potentially, but we have this belief that the art we're buying is the traditional art, I should say, the oil painting we're buying, is valuable because of what it is. But that's not the case, because I can go out and I can buy oil paints, I can buy a canvas, I can buy exactly the material that equals, you name the painting. You can go and buy everything that made, a current piece of work. You can't put it together though, and you can't put it together with the same thought and feeling. And because of that, I think maybe that's what you're buying. Maybe what you're buying is the difference that the artist brings to it, their philosophy, their approach, their talent. So that's
history
the case
too, right? And prestige, experience, it's the amalgamation of everything, right?
But it is not the physical material.
Yes.
And so you do not need the physical material of a canvas or a real world piece of art more than you need the NFT. So to me, I'm like, oh yeah, they're buying the artist's idea. They're buying their idea or their expression of an idea in the simplest form. And I love that. I'm in favor of that. Yeah. What's happened, how big the market's got, how big it's gotten this quickly, I'm excited about it. And, it goes to like, who's the audience? Who bought all this stuff? Is it all investors, or was there somebody who's like, that's a cool thing I'd like to own? At some point, somebody bought some art because they love the art. And while that might not make up the entirety of the market, just like some people don't buy houses because they love the house and see themselves there, they see it as an investment. Both are fine. Both are, it's human nature. But I do love the idea that we're not talking about immediately people only investing in crypto, and that blew up the market. Yeah. It was art that blew up the market. And to me, because of the mystery of art, because of the idea that like there's a lot of outsiders who don't know where value is going to come and where it's going to go, the hype built and built and built and built. And, are we bottoming out? Are we flattening out a little bit? Yes. And will this market continue? I don't know. I mean, who knows? Yeah. But there was a moment in time where people were willing to spend a lot of money for interesting ideas. And I think that should be something we're excited about.
But, what's interesting, because we've talked about this, also in a past episode, that art was the thing we could all understand that made us make sense of the technology. Like it was the layer on top of the technology that we could all understand, because it was so complicated, right? And like harkening back to that toy theory by Christensen, where like, oftentimes disruptive tech looks like a toy. It looks like something we don't need, right? Or something that's just frivolous before it really like snowballs really quickly into something big. And I truly do believe that's what we're seeing here. And you're right, art is so universal. And so that's why we could all get on the same page. And
but it's the whole idea, as you said, I think that you really reframed the whole idea of what NFTs are. It's selling the idea. And even though that was taken advantage of by a lot of projects that were scams, which is kind of the dark side of selling an idea, it goes to show you that it isn't just about the physical JPEG. It's about the idea behind it, the person behind it, and you're not buying the physical thing. You're buying because you believe in the person who created it and what they have to offer, right? And
Yeah.
that's kind of where we got here. And it was a combination of traders trying to make money, but also I've met so many people who bought it into these projects because they believed in it or they wanted to own some of it. And that, the fact that you can sell ideas means that there's endless opportunity. Like you guys pitch ideas that are crazy all the time. And so, and now in this whole entire new medium, you can do even other crazy ideas that you can sell. And you can sell it in a way that is decentralized and it empowers people who usually never could buy the ideas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's a fair point.
I think it's really cool.
I mean, it is just a fascinating moment right now. And I do think, we'll see when sort of, and there is a difference too between, sort of profile pictures and then just art where people aren't sure where it's going to go.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a difference there that I find interesting as well. Because if you're buying art you love, you're buying this like experience of observing, experience of contemplating, and let's be honest, the wellness industry is sort of based on having a moment to contemplate in a lot of cases. And that's what you're buying. And I think that's a great moment. If you're buying it because you happen to be looking at, a piece of art by, Beeple or something, and you get that moment out of it. Well, what's the value of that? Right. And so, it's either immeasurable or it's nothing. It depends what you want it to be. And I feel like that to me is a really fascinating sort of thing that people were willing to buy. Now, of course, as soon as somebody's willing to pay for that, other actors will want to come in and, sort of commoditize the market. Yeah, of course. And it's unfortunate that that's happened to such a high degree. But, either way, it truly, when you think about it, for me and the title of your, I'll give you this plug on your own show. Not a JPEG. It's like, yeah, it isn't. You know what? It was never a canvas. It's never just a glass of wine. It's the provenance. It's, whatever the sommelier tells you you're supposed to taste, you start to taste. It isn't that. It is what you want it to be. And it is the power of the person who created it coming back to you. And that's the baseline for our industry and for real great art in the world. So we had that moment. Is it continuing? Is it going to go longer? Is it going to come back around at some point? I'm not sure, but it was really, really exciting.
I was gonna say, I think like that's a mic drop right there, Matt. By the way, that whole little bit, I don't know if you planned that, but that's like we could just end the show right there. Be like, boom, done, amazing. So I think as we chug along in this interview, I'd love to get your thoughts on the volatility of the space in general, because obviously the blockchain tech is very closely linked to the actual crypto that is used to pay for certain fees and stuff and exchange goods and / services in the space. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the volatility of the space, the current bear market we're in, and how that might affect the projects or the space
adoption,
as a whole, or the adoption.
The outlook of bigger brands that you're working with.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a concern I hear a lot about. And I think it is, in some degree, something you can compartmentalize away from the project you're working on or away from how a brand should act in some of the spaces. And, I do think the value of Ethereum, the value of, Solana or something is less important to how a brand can act than I think people give onus to. There is, in many ways, it's creating noise and negative noise in this case. And it was at some point creating positive noise. I think people came into the space because they saw Bitcoin going through the roof.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, what else can we do? NFT is cool. Like, what else can we do?
Yeah.
It's
100%.
like, that's all. It's like they're giving away free money, which I haven't gotten yet, but I'll let you know. But now that there's a negative side to it and it's all getting tied in, that is affecting two things: the faith of potential clients for me and the understanding and faith of consumers. So if a consumer starts to believe that somehow FTX is tied to Decentraland and they start to put that together, well, that's not good because you're getting this wash of negativity across the space. But my number one job is to talk to actual people in a creative way to make them feel a certain way about a brand or a product or something. So I have to take that into account, of course. And, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. I think it's short term. Personally, I don't think, and I'm not talking about the bear market or the levels of value, because that's not my expertise. But I think the confusion part of it, or the wash that's happening from crypto values across metaverse activation or across Web3 and brand adoption, I think that's short-lived. And the reason I think that's short-lived or will be short-lived is because, I can see that my own children and Roblox and the activity level there is still going to be something we can take forward into the future of wherever, sort of like metaverse and the use of NFTs and blockchain technology takes us. Now, recognizing Roblox is not on the blockchain, it still is the guiding thing for me. That's every time I start to think, hey, if we're not getting the numbers we'd like to see, either, actual people visiting a certain platform, or we're not seeing on like an ether scan enough sort of like purchases in these platforms, what can we, where can we look for why we should be concerned? And it is younger people whose lives have been reared in a digital space like this. So we don't need, quote unquote, early adopters into metaverse, because we don't need them necessarily, because there is people who are already there, already flourishing there, already developing real relationships with other people, with other players, and of course, with the brands that are in those spaces. I think I'm less concerned with the long-term sort of use of understanding the principles we've talked about around how to speak to avatars, how to, understand how a brand can activate in a certain space. But it makes me wonder, is Roblox eventually going to port some of their younger demographic into something new? Will that be a different sort of, platform that exists there? Or will it still be washed with blockchain? And I think most people don't think of Roblox necessarily as related to Bitcoin for good reason.
They definitely don't.
Or it's related, but they do see news of Sandbox, NFTs, and everything else. Now, it could be because those are blockchain based, but it could also just be because the activity feels so different. And so because of right now, there's a wash across NFTs, and it just looks like lots of money is being wasted and or stolen. And that is the major headline for the last 6 months in my world, right? From people coming to me saying, what's going on? And I can't dismiss it. I'm like, well, that's a cultural observation maybe we need to work with for your brand, to either maybe not be in a decentralized sort of metaverse and to focus somewhere else. But I feel like that is going to go away because the activity that exists, the notion of digital ownership with or without blockchain, is something that the younger generation already understands in a way I never could and you never could, because we didn't grow up getting our allowance in Robux.
Yes.
And, it's sort of what will happen there. Or is that going to accelerate into blockchain adoption 25 years from now, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, where they're like, oh yeah, okay, cool. So Robux, they don't have to translate in their brains, I don't think, dollars to, sort of Bitcoin. They're going to need to translate Robux to Bitcoin. Yeah. And that is a different leap. That's a very different leap, and you might argue a much simpler one. So, I think the bear market, the current bear market, everything else long-term is going to have very little impact on digital activity. And I'm using general terms intentionally here, that we're seeing right now primarily happen in Metaverse, Web3, NFT activation.
Right.
I think that's going to change going forward, because I think the adoption that the rate of like younger people have now just has to carry forward. It just has to.
And it's interesting you say that. So, because I love what you said there. We've touched on it too. We, 100% agree about the digital mindset. Granted, we still remember growing up with, I would say, like the earliest prototypes of this kind of pay to play or buy digital goods within the game, with like Neopets
Club Penguin
and Habbo Hotel for me specifically. Like my parents wouldn't give me money to buy, a pixelated couch, just the sono value. And we kind of saw it, but it was more of a geeky outlier thing. It wasn't like as mainstream as it is now. And everything you said, we agree with. We've seen it in our, our own nephew, who obviously like gets V-Bucks for all of his Fortnite. But my question for you is, and I wonder if that, like, does that translate to brands? Do most people clue in like, oh shit, the stuff we're seeing with NFTs and digital ownership there is the exact same thing that my kids are doing on these platforms? Like, have they made that connection? Do they see the one-to-one? Because I think like, so that's my first question. And the second part to that is, will that affect who brands target as far as trying to sell their stuff to? Like, are they going to go after the younger demographic because they know that this is a group that already understands it?
I mean, I do think exactly what you're saying is they start to get they get an understanding of, and I think the most common way to do it is, why did somebody pay this much for an NFT? and then you say, well, why did you give, this, your nephew or your son money to buy basically something that is just,
an NFT.
pixels.
Yep.
It is, but it isn't actually, they don't have actual ownership in the way that it's tied to the blockchain, right? So it's almost like, it's interesting. And then, so I think they get that. I do think they understand digital ownership is something that is valid.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally agree that it's valid. And I think it's, especially when it's in a social setting, like some of these game platforms allow for, where if your shirt, doesn't matter what brand it is, if your cool shirt on your avatar in Roblox, if you're on one of these Brookhaven games or something, which frankly is very young, so I don't want to say we should be talking to that demographic now. I'm just like, their activity level is going to impact what they're doing later. I do feel like there's definitely a moment there where what you're selling is the idea, and if it's a branded outfit, of what that brand stands for.
Yeah.
And it is no different to me than what the logo on your golf shirt or your polo shirt says to people outwardly. It is the exact same sort of translation of understanding around that person. So if you're wearing a really bold shirt, or a crazy band t-shirt that is super hard to get or whatever, people understand what that means. It says something about you. I know we know this. That exact same reality exists in the digital space where people are spending an immense amount of time as an avatar. Now, I think we've hyped up beyond what we needed to necessarily where these avatars are and which avatars are the most important. And, will there be a decentralized, the wish for a decentralized sort of metaverse where it's completely interoperable? And, I don't know. But I do understand from an advertising perspective that the logo you happen to be wearing or the brand cues on your outfit will carry with it some weight. And so why wouldn't you bring that with you into the digital space? Mm-hmm. Granted, we're out of lockdown now and things are moving back, so we're not spending quite as many hours. But there was a time where you were definitely spending much, yes. And in some cases, this is still true, more time interacting with people in that space. Why wouldn't you want to bring more of yourself to it? Why wouldn't you want to use the proxy of a pattern or a brand or whatever to say something about yourself? That's just, human nature. Yeah. So I understand, I think, why some of the big fashion houses are investing in Roblox and having things there. Absolutely. Because it starts to establish their brand value in a very interesting way, but very early, in the adoption of digital goods. Hopefully not too young. I mean, that's the concern, but I trust that, the platforms are pretty good at policing that stuff from what I understand. And so it's not, the wrong people aren't seeing things, but it is the same thing as the store window, as the expression of the person who's dressed really, really well at a party. And you say, oh, where'd you get that? And you hear about that happens all the time.
Yep.
It's just that in the digital world and, in some of these metaverses is the availability to stretch what the brain can do to an avatar is immense. Yes. You're not stuck. You can have a jetpack if you want to, have the next cool things. You can make people fly. You don't have to be stuck with, the logo that happens to be on the shirt necessarily. There's a million ways to get branded.
Yeah.
Right.
You've talked about that a lot too, that there's endless possibility with creativity in a digital space, in terms of your avatar and your digital identity. Yeah. You're no longer limited to just the physical body or the physical manufacturing capacities. Right?
Well, I think a lot of the things that we do in the real world obviously can now translate into this digital world because we've now, we have this element of, all right, we've got a digital currency that works just as well as the physical currency. We've got these digital goods that are having just as much value as physical goods. So in theory, you could start replicating a lot of the stuff that went really well and was really successful in the physical world and start doing them in the digital world to a new audience that may have never seen those things, right? Things come in cycles. So there is that opportunity for sure, if you're into that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where brands can play, is that if you see an activity that you can create a proxy for what you would do in the real world, then you can play there. And this is where we see some concerts happening in the metaverse, and people seeing a famous celebrity. Well, a smart brand is going to activate around that, of course. And can you pay a few people? Can you do a direct to avatar play where a few people are wearing your brand's T-shirt who are at that concert that other people are seeing? Is it that simple? Is it popping up at a concert with a street team? That kind of activity, I think, is going to exist. I think there's really interesting opportunities when the crowd gets to what we need it to be, or the usage gets to a number you need to be, to have, guerrilla marketing in a digital space, in a metaverse based place. That can be really interesting. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Right now, I don't feel, and I don't advise clients that this is a guarantee that there's a moment where you should just, put people in a bunch of cool, sort of cars and drive around Decentraland and everyone's going to see them and it's going to change the world. Like, we're not there yet, but you can start to set up the experiments, the right innovations,
Right.
and then judge those innovations and, value them to go, okay, this is what we could or couldn't do here. And this is why it's interesting. And that's just obviously just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. So that kind of leads me into the next question. Like, where do you see the future of traditional advertising in Web3? Like, we've kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of how people are playing now and experimenting. Where do you see this going?
I mean, to me, it's so hard to predict.
Yeah.
And I get that whatever I say now, you'll be able to play back in a matter of maybe weeks, maybe years, whatever, and be like, how wrong were you? But I think just looking at where we've been, I'm not even 100% convinced that brands will play that much outwardly to consumer off of blockchain. I do see how blockchain can impact, how a brand activates a loyalty program with blockchain-based sort of reward points. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense. Being able to just keep data on the blockchain and like, what about actual results being recorded on the blockchain?
Yeah.
And so an agency can share with their client, this is how it did. Look, here's the results. They're here.
Yeah.
They're not going anywhere. You're always going to have that transparency to them. The notion of a blockchain being public and transparent is really interesting. But I can't stay in here, sort of hand on heart and go, a blockchain is going to exist for all this stuff. I can't say that for sure. In the digital space, brands will always have this interesting relationship with consumers where we lead sometimes, but mostly follow. And I do feel like that's fine. If you see a crowd of people doing something and you have a legitimate way in to engage with that crowd, build that activity, hopefully enhance it, work with them, that's always going to be there. And I think we'll be welcomed by the right brands at the right time and sort of pushed away by the wrong brands at the wrong time. And we'll learn the difference for our clients as we go. You always have to have a really healthy understanding. We know this as people who work in the industry. Nobody's waiting for advertising. Nobody's like looking forward to the next ad. It's very rare. Super Bowl notwithstanding.
Yes.
Super Bowl notwithstanding. Go Giants, by the way. But I do feel like there's this moment where we're going to see, if you see a group of people, great brands are going to figure out a way to like harness the power of what they're doing and work with them. Hopefully, offer them something they want, provide them a promise of something, and all over. The blockchain Web3 world, there are people doing interesting things. Sometimes it's going to be a ham-handed attempt to get in there. Sometimes it's going to be a smarter approach. But if I'm being really honest about traditional brand advertising, I don't think we now know how it's going to exist in that place. Depending on how far out we're looking. I do feel like the blockchain is providing a really interesting either place to house all this stuff I mentioned, or to build a loyalty program off of, or a model for them to potentially have, some sort of open blockchain that they can now use as a ledger to create their own sort of loyalty programs or their own cryptocurrency. I can see it. I can see reward points being treated that way. So it's really tough. It's hard to say, where it's going to go. And I think that's why it's an really exciting place to be, an exciting place to talk about. I think, we probably should like once in a while just get together and say, okay, what do we think is going to happen this year?
Yes.
And then reopen that vault a year later and be like, nope, wrong.
Yeah.
I would have never predicted that like, a pizza brand could sell, little JPEGs of its pizzas for the amount of money they were able to sell it 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, whatever that was. That's amazing. Like, that's really interesting. And that's a brand experience. Has that become a best practice of like, just put your product out there and sell it? No. Does that mean that was not valid? No, but it's just like, okay, so where are we going with this? Right. Yeah. And I really look forward to what does come next. I look forward to the sort of geniuses out there who we don't know what they're up to. We don't know who the next artifact is or the next sort of really interesting design house in the metaverse and what they're doing and why they're doing it. And we equally aren't totally sure what's going on with the consumer and what their take on it is. And I mean the mass consumer now, because we're talking about traditional brand advertising to the masses. What's their take on all this, and where are they going to end up? And the things that create sort of that like critical mass of people to adopt a technology or to visit a platform are, for the most part, I'd say unpredictable. You don't know. You don't know why all of a sudden, and I think there's a good example. We talked about this when we spoke earlier. There's a good example of a brand helping the platform along. And I feel like Dove Evolution, long time ago, an old Web 1, Web 2, like if you consider YouTube sort of a social network at the time, example of YouTube, pre-Google YouTube, great video, amazing sort of heartfelt message, on Dove and their Evolution video that I think, for me anyway, sort of changed the way we shared videos amongst our friends from QuickTime videos you found somewhere online and then sent around by email to socializing the video sharing. And I think Evolution and how many people wanted to see the Dove film, they also were going to YouTube for the first time to see that film. And so that's a great example of how a brand can help a platform. Could something happen? Could Snoop Dogg in Sandbox partner? And I think he brought a lot of people to be curious about
100%
what Sandbox
he did.
was.
Yeah.
Right. So does he partner with the right person? Maybe Martha Stewart. Does he partner with the right brand? And he, all of a sudden, the critical mass goes there, because it's not always the coolest or the best or the most interesting platform that thrives. It's sometimes just the one where people are, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And the reasons to get there, you can't always engineer that. To bring this to like more, since we're talking about traditional advertising, it's sort of like trying to figure out right now, looking, as you're driving in on the highway to downtown on the Gardner or, whatever city you're going into, and seeing billboards. It's almost like somebody's painted the side of a building, somebody's put up an actual billboard, there's a digital board. We don't know which one is going to get the most attention yet, because we're not even talking about content. We're just talking about space. And I think some of these platforms, and we just say Web3 in general, we are just talking about sort of a place.
Yeah, it's a media space. Yeah, absolutely.
How do we know which one's going to be the most important? What brands will activate there? So I do feel like it's so wide open, and this is where these little sort of like focused tests, experiments, innovations, working with the brand to help them figure those out. They may set the best practice. They may really bring to life this notion of this is where you should be. This is how you activate. Or they may do something brilliant that everybody loves that we all move away from after. Yeah. You never know.
And I love your answer, Matt, because it's absolutely true. Like everything you've touched on, I think actually that's the most eloquent answer you could provide, given how loaded the question was.
Yeah.
Because I totally understand that asking you something like this is like the equivalent of trying to predict, social media and influencer marketing in like the early 90s, right? There was no way to know that this is the root, that they were going to play such a pivotal role in the way, brands promote their wares online, right? And so, I think that's also where the excitement lies in us. And part of us creating this podcast is, I think we mentioned it to you earlier, is staying accountable to the developments in the space.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the only way you're going to be able to
100%.
push it and push that needle when it comes to innovation. As we sort of wrap up the interview, I do have sort of an overarching question is, you've obviously been dabbling in this space for probably a year and a half. What's the biggest lesson you've learned from, just exploring and participating in Web3?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to really try to distill that to one lesson if I can.
Good luck.
I'd say, more than anything, and this may not be the most unique answer. It might be a bit cliche, but prepare for change. Prepare for change. Prepare for user behavior to be different week to week. Prepare for values to change very quickly in either direction. And I think, it speaks to an underlying sense that if you are a brand, you have to have resilience, and you have to be ready to expect the change to happen. It's a little bit more now like being at a live event at all times, I think, where you're not 100% sure like what the weather's going to bring, what the crowd's going to do, et cetera. And so you have to prepare for that. But brands who understand themselves and truly like believe in their own purpose, their own vision, will be fine. They just have to know that they're going to have to change quite quickly, and that's okay. You can build that into your metaverse activation. You just got to know that change is coming, and that you can take two roads there. I think one is you become as resilient as possible, and you sort of go out there and try a bunch of different things. The other one is you pull back and you wait and you watch. But any second that you're not activating as a brand is a lost second, I think. It's a negative. You have to say something or you lose that availability. Now, I'm speaking of the mass brands and stuff, the non-mystique based brands, but brands that are like, hey, I'm known for innovation. I'm known for the demographic that speaks to it. Whether you're a potato chip brand that wants to be the brand in the bowl next to the laptop or next to the Oculus or whatever it happens to be, or you want to be in that space, as a really innovative sort of fashion brand, outfitting avatars, etc. Prepare to change. Change. And to me, I think it's interesting that your core values will be maintained, have to be maintained in and around a world of massive change. The upside of being there, despite all this, is that you're going to, I think you can win out hearts and minds that way by being still with the user, still with them. You can't necessarily, I think, predict exactly what you should do next if you don't start doing something now. So that's what I would say is probably my biggest lesson. And also from an outsider or user perspective, taste switch quickly. I think there's probably a lot of people who came out with, sort of a bunch of profile pictures that they wanted to make sure everybody was buying. And we've all seen it. We saw what happened when what Bored Apes did and how all of a sudden there was, derivations of Bored Apes that had nothing to do with Bored Apes that looked the same or used the same word or, had apes, but they were cyber, there's all these different things. Yep. Imitation will always be imitation, and understanding what drove people to want to adopt a certain sort of look and feel for their profile picture or be a part of one club over the other is not something you have to repeat. It's not something that's going to be stagnant, but what as a brand can you do to build off of that? And how can you do it? And you'll never know if you don't engage.
Yeah, those are like straight facts. I 100% agree with that. But I have a follow-up to that. Knowing how slow brands move in making decisions, do you think they're going to get their act together and move as fast as the space, or are they going to really struggle trying to keep up?
Again, it's like some will, some won't. Right. I think there are some brands who are probably, and we've seen them, they're hiring people in the space and they're looking at it, and they will and they won't. And I think that as long as you go in and you're trying to take something out of it beyond just the presence of being there, you'll win. You'll be okay. You'll get the knowledge. You'll get closer to the person you want to have a longer term relationship with. It always comes back to the user for me. And no matter what the technology is, you're not going to ever reach them by not trying to talk to them. And, we didn't touch a lot on this, and maybe this will be a follow-up one day or just, private conversation, but what is the user's mindset in the metaverse that differentiates it from the user's mindset on the bus? Now, we've gone into detail about, they're the same person, but is a user in metaverse playing a game? Is that the way they are in Vegas or on vacation or at a sporting event? Right. Is it that mentality? Because you can change your messaging and speak to them a little bit differently based on who they are. Or are they more creative, more sort of individualistic, more secure, and so your messaging changes a little bit. So I do feel like it's about the user, and to get this detail, a little bit more understanding about the user, to learn, to experiment. The stuff I keep hitting on. I think you have to do something. Right. You can wait and watch and draw conclusions from what somebody else does, but firsthand sort of knowledge, experience, data that then you store on the blockchain for yourself later. All of that is something you have to gain here. And so it's probably worthwhile. And while that might not be, hey, everybody's now wearing a blank brand t-shirt all over sort of, whatever metaverse, it could be, look at this behavior. Look what's happening here. Look how they're working together. Look how they're not working together. How can we speak to the rugged individual? Just take any sort of old school target sketch and go, who is that person's avatar? And that's a fun sort of process to go through, and a really interesting and valuable one for brands, I think, even if they just do that.
Yeah. Wow. Definitely.
Yeah. And I mean, that's amazing, Matt. Thank you. And we've spanned such a, I would say, it's a very specific topic we've talked about, but there's been so many different things we've touched on, right? From, what you do at Ultralight to, your sort of ethos or what value you aim to bring to your clients, and everything sort of in between. Is there anything that we have not touched upon today that you think we may have missed that you just want to impart on our listeners?
Yeah, appreciate that. I mean, I don't know. Didn't we say everything? But literally,
I mean, did we really though?
we said everything and nothing, as is, what we do.
Yeah.
I would just say that this technology, other technologies that are out there that have nothing to do with blockchain that people are excited about, I would just hope as a person first, then maybe secondarily as a marketer or a creative person or whatever, dismiss none of it. Don't dismiss any of it, and go into it open-mindedly to understand who's already there, learn from them, and then participate. I think there's nothing better to me than a marketer who's like, I don't know how my brand activates here, but here's what I do, which you don't hear often enough.
Yes.
And I would say, if you're an art lover and you happen to work for a big brand, or you happen to work for an agency, and you're sort of looking at these galleries, or you know what Christie's does, and then how do they work with their sort of NFT artists? Use that as an opportunity as a human being, as somebody who has just individualized tastes, to get yourself in here and then figure out the brand. The brand shouldn't be something completely separate from behavior you have. And I'd say this, if somebody's coming to you saying you need to build a metaverse presence, you need a store here or whatever, that's not necessarily true either. You can make use of the brand connectivity in this place, or the opportunity to have that connectivity without being fully present necessarily in the traditional form brought into metaverse. Apple has a presence there, for example, whether they build an Apple store there or don't. There's an understanding that it's going to be talked about, or somebody's going to speak to it, or it's going to remind somebody of an Apple story. There's a lot of opportunities for brands to have presence that isn't the traditional, you have to go and build a huge thing.
Yeah.
So I think that should be understood as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for your time and for your insights and wisdom. And I look forward to looking back on this episode in a year with you, at episode 99, and laughing at everything we just talked about.
And just reevaluating. And I would say just one last thing, Matt, before you do go.
Yes.
If someone wants to get in touch with you, they want to work with you, they love what they've heard, and they want to chat more, how can they reach you and get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, if they're not completely sick of my voice by now and they want to get a little bit more, they can reach me at, and I don't know, can you put this up somewhere?
150%.
I would say, if you're at home with a pencil and a pad, matt.hassell@ultralightcreative.ca, just shoot me an email there. And I would love to connect and talk more about this, and let's learn together and let's teach together, and let's figure out how to innovate for ourselves, for brands, for your side hustle, for whatever it is, because I do feel like the more conversation we have around the space, that is another way to not allow for the hype to get so out of control and for bad actors to take advantage, when we're having more open conversations of what it should be. And let's go back to that, that philosophy we talked about at the top of, let's all make it. Let's all, have impact here and create what we want to.
Wag me.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you very much, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Well, Matt has certainly changed my perspective on a number of ideas I had about the Web3 space.
I'm curious to hear what they are.
Well, his whole point about the fact that we're selling ideas, like, I see you working in the advertising space, and it is all about selling ideas, and that's exactly what happened in the bull run and what NFTs essentially were. We were just selling the idea and the promise of this thing, whether it be art or PFPs or some sort of utility or whatever. And we all bought into it. Like, we bought into so many ideas, which is, buying ideas is not something that most people do on a day-to-day basis. It's very common in your industry, but this is kind of like a first, ecosystem where you have that mass buying of ideas. And a lot of it was scams. But, he had such a hopeful take on it. And the fact that for creativity, especially, this is going to be a really awesome space to do really unique things. And it brought me, it was a whole breath of fresh air for me on the whole concept of selling ideas.
So I assume it reinforced the idea that it is, in fact, not a JPEG.
Yeah, that was such a good take. I love that.
Yeah, that's a mic drop in my opinion.
It was. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode as much as we enjoyed interviewing Matt.
Mm-hmm.
If you'd like to stay up to date with everything Not a JPEG, make sure you hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening to this podcast. And you can always check us out on every social media platform at Not a JPEG Podcast. We'd so love to connect with you and help build this community of creativity more together. And make sure with that you tell all of your creative friends, creative people that you work with, whoever it may be, that Not a JPEG is your new favorite podcast. Thanks so much.
We'll see you next week.